שוב שלום לכולם, קולוקוויום פקולטי, היום השביעי לדצמבר 2020, מזמן לא נפגשנו, ויש לנו את הכבוד היום להיפגש שוב, ואנחנו נשמע את ההרצאה של מתן, שלחתי לפני שבוע, גם את הכותרת, גם את הנושאים, גם מאמר שעליו ההרצאה מבוססת, כך שאני מניח שלפחות עברתם על החומרים ויודעים לקראת מה אנחנו הולכים. אני רק אגיד ששבוע הבא כולנו בחופש, אז יש לנו את חנוכה שבוע הבא, מן הסתם לא יהיה קולוקוויום, ואנחנו נמשיך עם הקולוקוויום בהמשך, זאת אומרת הפעם הבאה שניפגש אחרי ההרצאה הזאת, יהיה בעוד שבועיים. אני אשלח כרגיל את החומרים קצת זמן מראש, כדי שנוכל להסתכל על הדברים. וזהו, אני אעביר את השרביט למתן, להרצאה שלו, ההרצאה תתנהל באנגלית, נכון מתן? זה מה לטובת מי שדובר עברית. אתם מוזמנים להתבטא אחרי זה בכל שפה שתרצו, בתנאי שתניחו רובנו נבין אותם, וזהו, שיהיה חג שמח שבוע הבא, ואני מעביר את השרביט עכשיו למתן, תודה רבה, וקדימה.
Okay, thank you, Dani. Thank you for the invitation. I joined the Technion. I'll share the screen in the meantime. I'm a postdoc in the Technion in moment. Okay, so I'm a postdoc in the Fair Transit Lab, which is Karl Martin's lab. I joined the Technion in January, but then COVID came and I hardly came to the Technion, so I'm glad for the opportunity to interact with faculty and students, and for you to get to know me and for me to get to know everyone. This project was part of my PhD dissertation that I defended in January. So I'll present on that. Hopefully in the future I can present on my postdoc research, which is on travel behavior of people with cognitive disabilities. So I'll start with my talk, and my talk is about housing supply and housing costs in 23 metropolitan areas in the United States, and kind of testing the argument that if we increase housing supply, then housing costs will be moderated or go down, or at least not go up as much. And I'm testing this hypothesis, basically. Over the years, especially since, for example, in this graph, since 1980, housing costs, both in rent in the blue and median house value in gray, have increased considerably in the United States, more than 25–26% over the years, whereas income has only increased overall in about 7%. So people are experiencing higher housing costs, but don't have as high incomes to pay for those housing costs, which is creating housing costs pressures in the US. And I think if I took data for Israel, it's probably similar or even more drastic, where housing costs have increased over time much faster than income, and we're experiencing very high housing costs. But housing costs don't increase only on average, they also increase in different neighborhood types. So different neighborhoods with different characteristics of built environments or different amenities like retail or education will increase at different rates over time. And what we see here basically is that the transit-oriented development which is often considered a very highly demanded neighborhood type, has increased. That's the red dotted or dashed line kind of on the top, and it has increased the most over time. And so the question is, one question I try to address is, if we increase housing supply in high demand neighborhoods like transit-oriented development, would that moderate housing costs? Will that make housing costs more affordable or less expensive at least? And there are many factors that affect housing costs, and the literature has dealt with all of them, but has done so separately for each characteristic. So we know that socio-demographic characteristics like income and education are related to housing costs. For example, higher income households will be able and will be willing to pay more for housing. Others won't be able to pay as much for housing. So income is related to housing costs. Housing and neighborhood characteristics, of course, are related to housing costs. Larger apartments are more expensive. Newer apartments are more expensive. And then some urban form characteristics make housing more attractive and more expensive. For example, walkable environments or being close to, or amenities like being close to a park or green spaces make housing, are incorporated into housing costs, and housing near them are more expensive. And then also transportation characteristics, like distance from the central business district or employment opportunities, or in Israel now we see it with transit accessibility, public transport accessibility. So housing close to rail stations are more expensive than housing farther away from rail stations. So different amenities and different services and how people value them affect housing costs. And all of this is at the neighborhood level, but of course there are also metropolitan level factors that affect housing costs, like land use regulation that limit or allow more supply of housing will affect costs. If we limit housing supply, which is the main argument both in Israel and in the United States of the macro trends that affect housing costs, is that some regulation limit the supply of housing at the national or regional level, and because of that, there's more demand than supply, and housing costs are larger. So if we increase supply, what we can infer from that argument is that if we increase supply, housing costs should be moderated. And also at the metropolitan level, urban form and transportation characteristics could affect housing costs at a metropolitan, not just a neighborhood level. But the literature often deals with these topics or issues separately. So some studies will only look at socio-demographic characteristics. Some would only look at housing or at transportation characteristics and how they affect housing costs. And often and some would look at metropolitan level housing supply characteristics or supply and demand relationships and how they affect costs, but they don't look at the interactions between metropolitan level and neighborhood level characteristics. And that's one thing that I wanted to do, is basically look at how or if metropolitan housing supply, especially in high demand neighborhoods, how does it affect or does it moderate neighborhood housing costs? So if we accept the argument that if we increase housing supply in general or in high demand neighborhoods or regions in particular, would that actually moderate housing costs and lead to more affordable housing costs? And that's what I'm trying to test in this talk, and that was part of my dissertation. And you can, we'll leave it to the end to see what happens. I think the results are very interesting. So how did I study this? I adopted a multi-level cross-sectional analysis, so a regression analysis with multi-level regression, and I'll talk a little bit about that, on neighborhoods, or from the census, I took block groups, which is a small unit, so neighborhoods in 23 metropolitan areas, and I divided each neighborhood, I divided neighborhoods into 6 neighborhood types, so I'll go over that quickly. So the multi-level approach says that, or takes into account that neighborhoods, for example, or observations or neighborhoods in a metropolitan area will have similar characteristics to other neighborhoods in that metropolitan area. And we want to kind of control for that in the regression analysis. So we have a multi-level analysis where we control for that metropolitan level effect. So we only capture the neighborhood level variation. So that's basically what the multi-level approach does. And that was necessary because I took data from 23 metropolitan areas in the United States with different characteristics and different types. So we have here from New York in the east to Los Angeles and San Francisco in the west. And what all these metropolitan areas have in common is that they have a rail system, because I wanted to look at neighborhoods both close to rail systems, rail stations, and far from rail stations, and see how that affects housing costs. And if we talk about transit-oriented development, then that is usually developed around rail stations in the United States. And both in Israel now we hear more talk about kind of densifying areas that will have, that the metro or the light rail in Tel Aviv will be, where along the light rail and metro in Tel Aviv, we want to denser development around those stations to allow more people access to public transport. So those areas are in high demand in the United States. They've been found to have very high housing costs relative to other neighborhood types. So I wanted to focus on those neighborhoods. And what I'm testing in this project, or what I'm presenting here, is that if we increase the supply of those transit-oriented development, will that moderate housing costs in transit-oriented development and in other neighborhood types? So I took publicly available data from multiple sources, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the United States Census, housing and urban development data, and other sources to kind of combine and create a unique data set that allows me to answer multiple questions, not just the one I'm asking today. And as I said, I took all the neighborhoods that I have and categorized them based on their built environment and proximity to rail stations to produce 6 neighborhood types. And I adopt a typology that other authors have used before, which first identifies transit-oriented development, which are neighborhoods that are close to a rail station. In my research, it's 750 meters walking distance from a rail station. And these neighborhoods are dense. They have 8 housing units per acre, which translates into 32 housing units per dunam. And they're very walkable. In the walk score that I used, which goes from 1 to 20, very walkable is larger than 15. So these are very walkable neighborhoods. And I add and I identify a similar neighborhood to transit-oriented development, but for neighborhoods that are more than 750 meters from the rail station. So those are non-rail pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods. So these are compact neighborhoods, walkable neighborhoods, either close or away from rail stations. Next, we have intermediate development neighborhoods, which are either dense, either more than 8 housing units per acre, or walkable, but not both. So that's how they're different from transit-oriented development. And again, one neighborhood type close to rail stations and one farther from rail stations. And finally, we have the more suburban neighborhood types, which are, the first one is transit adjacent development. It's usually low density, low walkability, but close to a rail station in the suburbs. And then the similar but non-rail counterpart to that is auto-oriented development, which is single family, low density, low walkability, suburban development, farther from rail stations. So that's, in a nutshell, the methodology and the key data. And if there are other questions about that, I can answer later, but I think the more interesting parts are kind of the results. So I'll dive into those. First, I want to show a graph that today I realized I didn't attach to the paper I sent. So there were two figures that I took out when I submitted the paper and I forgot, so here it is. And this is just a graph of the share of housing units or of block groups, it's actually housing units in each type of neighborhood type. And what we see here is that in the vast majority of metropolitan areas, more than 50% of housing units are in auto-oriented development in the very suburban, single-family, low-density neighborhoods. And that's very characteristic of U.S. metropolitan areas where most development is for single-family housing. And then some, the next very prevalent neighborhood type is non-rail intermediate development. That's usually higher density, a little bit more higher walkability neighborhoods, but again, not close to rail. And only a small portion of metropolitan areas like New York and Boston and San Francisco have a variety of neighborhood types and not just single family, low density housing. So this really shows how limited supply of transit-oriented development or transit-rich compact development there is in the United States. A little bit more characteristics about the different neighborhood types so we get a picture of what the data looks like. So we have transit-oriented development on the left and auto-oriented development on the right here. And we see that transit-oriented development and their non-rail, non-counterpart pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods are usually closer to the central business district. Transit-oriented development is higher density by definition, and it also enjoys a larger kind of higher transit or public transport accessibility because it's closer to transit and closer to employment. And as we move to the right, the neighborhoods are farther from the central business district. They're lower density, they're lower walkability, so they're more suburban, kind of like what I described before. So let's look at a few regression results. Actually, this slide and the next slide are from the same regression, but I just split it into kind of a way that should be easier to look at, kind of this socio-demographic and housing characteristics. So like I said, we see that median household income is associated with higher rent, which is the x-axis. And then this is annual rent. So like I said, higher income households are willing to pay more for rent and have more to pay for rent, and so they live in more expensive neighborhoods, but also new development in terms of the share of new development developed from 2000 to 2015 is associated with higher rent. So new apartments are more expensive than older apartments. And then on the other hand, smaller apartments are associated with lower rent, as we would imagine. And then younger adults are willing to pay more for rent. They live in higher rent neighborhoods, but Hispanic and Black households, which are usually lower income, live in lower rent neighborhoods. And then in terms of kind of variables that I'm more interested in, first, job accessibility, or the number of jobs accessible by within 45 minutes of public transport use is a very, it really has a strong effect on housing costs, on median gross rent. So 1 million, an increase of 1 million jobs in housing costs, in accessibility is associated with $853 in annual rent. And 1 million jobs sounds like a lot, but it's actually the difference between moving from an auto-oriented neighborhood to a transit-oriented neighborhood. So we see that difference in the same metropolitan area between neighborhoods, and that's almost $1,000 in rent. But then we see the different neighborhood types and how they are associated with rent relative to auto-oriented neighborhood, to the most suburban auto-oriented neighborhood type. And we see that only transit-oriented development is more expensive than that auto-oriented neighborhood type. The others are less expensive. So transit-oriented development, because of its built environment and because of its transit accessibility benefits, really has a premium over the car-oriented neighborhood. And what this graph shows us is that transit-oriented development, the most highly demanded, let's say it's in high demand currently, but it's also very expensive. So the question is, if we increase housing supply in this most expensive neighborhood type, would housing costs be more moderate than they are right now? So does housing supply moderate housing costs? I looked at different models to see the relationships between different types of supplies and housing costs. The first one was a measure of overall housing supply in a metropolitan area. So I took the ratio of metropolitan housing units to population, where we would assume or hypothesize that a larger ratio means that there are more housing units per population. So housing supply relative to the population of metropolitan area is larger. So we would expect housing costs to be moderated. Housing costs here are the y-axis. And we do see a negative trend. So as the ratio is larger, as there is a larger housing supply relative to the population, housing costs are lower. But if you read the paper, you notice that most of these relationships are not statistically significant. So the graph looks really nice, and this is what we wanted to see, but actually in statistical terms, there's no relationship between the ratio of metropolitan housing units to population and median gross rent. So if we increase housing supply in general without regard to what types of neighborhoods we're building or what types of housing we're building, we might not see the moderating effect that we want to see from increases in housing supply. Next, I tested the hypothesis that increasing housing supply or that larger housing supply in transit-oriented development will have a moderating effect on median gross rent. So if transit-oriented development is a high-demand neighborhood, then we should see that increasing housing supply in that neighborhood moderates or leads to a negative effect, negative relationship with housing costs. And what we see here actually is that for most neighborhood types, in higher or a larger share of housing units in transit-oriented development is associated with lower housing costs. But actually in transit-oriented development, the red dashed line, we see a positive relationship. So as we increase or metropolitan areas with a larger share of housing units in transit-oriented development are actually associated with higher housing costs in transit-oriented development rather than lower housing costs in transit-oriented development. So that's kind of counterintuitive, and it could mean that either there is kind of unmet demand for transit-oriented development, and that and that maybe increasing the supply of transit-oriented development kind of generates more demand for those neighborhoods. At least at the levels of housing units that we currently see, increasing supply of housing units in that neighborhood type actually might lead to counterintuitive or counterproductive results. Finally, I also looked at the share of housing units in rail-oriented intermediate development and how they are associated with median gross rent. Now, remember, these are high-density neighborhoods with high accessibility, but slightly lower walkability than transit-oriented development. If they had a little bit more walkability, they would be transit-oriented development. So they kind of serve as an alternative to transit-oriented development. They are also associated with lower shares of new housing units. So that could explain part of the results. But what we see here is that metropolitan areas with a larger share of housing units in rail-oriented intermediate development are associated with lower housing costs in all neighborhood types, even in transit-oriented development and in other neighborhood types. And all these are statistically significant results. And what this means is that, or what I think it means is that these neighborhoods allow separating demand for different types of neighborhoods. And so some people only want the transit could live in less walkable neighborhoods, and those that also want the walkability could live in transit-oriented development. So these neighborhoods allow separating demand in a way that moderates housing costs altogether. So I did it fairly quickly. We'll have a lot of time for discussion, but I'll just summarize the key results that we saw. Rent in transit-oriented development includes, in addition to a transportation premium, and I mentioned that, also a built environment premium. So people actually didn't show in the end this graph, but basically, even after controlling for neighborhood type and proximity to rail stations and transit accessibility, transit-oriented development is still more expensive than the auto-oriented development, meaning there is some kind of benefit for living there that is not just maybe even in the built environment. We also saw that a larger share of housing units in transit-oriented development in a metropolitan area is associated with higher housing costs overall. That was the overall, and especially in transit-oriented development. And then a larger share of housing units in alternative neighborhoods, for example, the rail-oriented intermediate development, moderates housing costs. So the conclusions are that there might be limits to the benefits of increasing supply just in transit-oriented development. And on the other hand, there are added benefits to increasing housing supply in a diversity of neighborhood types. And maybe that also means that we need to reevaluate the components of transit-oriented development as a policy solution for housing affordability. If increasing housing supply only if in transit-oriented development will result in higher rather than lower housing costs, then it's not a solution for housing affordability problems. So what are different housing policy measures that we can adopt if we do build transit-oriented development or for housing in general? One is rent assistance, especially in transit-rich neighborhoods where to allow people with lower incomes to live closer to transit and still be able to afford that accessibility benefit. We could take advantage of the higher housing costs in transit-oriented development and tax them to fund affordable housing solutions. And that's part of what they're talking about doing in the metro in Tel Aviv is taxing the development. I don't know if it's to provide affordable housing, but I think in Tel Aviv, it's to fund the metro, use the higher costs and take that money and fund the metro development. But also we should remove land use regulations, at least in the United States. In Israel, the case is a little bit different, and we can talk about the differences and similarities, but remove land use regulation to increase the supply of housing in a diverse set of neighborhood types. So what we see in the United States is that for several and different reasons, most of the new development is focused on transit-oriented development. But what we saw just now is that this is unlikely to lead to more affordable housing, at least in the short run. So removing these land use regulation and allowing development all over will allow building a diverse set of neighborhood types that could potentially moderate housing costs. So I'll say thank you. Took me 30 minutes, not 35, but we have 5 more minutes for discussion.
תודה רבה. שאלות, הערות? אז נתחיל בשאלה שלי, אם אין קופצים.
אוקיי.
אתה מנסה לתפוס אזורים שונים, על ידי זה שאתה תופס את האזור המטרופוליני, נכון? אם הבנתי נכון. הבדלים למשל של אקלים, דרום, צפון, חום, קור, האם לדעתך זה מספיק לתפוס אזורים מטרופוליניים, או אפשר לעשות משהו אחר כדי לבחון את הדברים האלה?
הייתי אומר שזה מספיק. אני חושב שדווקא אקלים ונושאים כאלה, לדעתי זה אמור להספיק. המולטי-לבל אמור לתפוס בעצם תופס כביכול את כל מה שלא נמצא במודל ושהוא ברמת המטרופולין. והוא תופס די הרבה. יש לי גרף אחר שאין לי פה, אבל יש לי גרף אחר שבעצם מראה את ההבדלים בין המטרופולינים בהכנסה. זה תופס די הרבה המולטי-לבל, לדעתי גם אקלים, אני לא רואה סיבה שהוא לא יכלול את זה.
אוקיי.
לא, בהנחה שהאקלים משפיע על עלויות מגורים במקרה הזה. אבל באופן קונספטואלי זה אמור לכלול, זה אמור לתפוס.
אוקיי.
לשחרר את המסך או שנוח לראות ככה?
לא יודע, הייתי אומר, נראה מה השאלות, אם יש שאלות לגבי נתונים ספציפיים. כולנו עייפים?
מוכנים לחנוכה.
הנה, קארל.
I raised my hand already before. Let's move to English. Because some people do not speak Hebrew, and some people have trouble speaking Hebrew. You talk about themes about averages, right? So, if you talk about housing increase, prices in general, and if you add transitory development, it increases even more there. The question is if it goes together with decreases somewhere or more slower trends. So I wonder if you try to disentangle a little bit the market as it's. Maybe I didn't understand it from your presentation, or maybe you didn't do it. Like disentangle both in terms of the types, which you did seem to do. But then within types, they can also be neighborhoods, of course, doing better, doing worse. So if rich people pay a lot, I couldn't care less, right? As long as there's also affordable housing somewhere in the metro, which is then not too far away from destinations, of course. So can you say a little bit about that?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that. You're right that this is mostly on average. So, for example, I don't know. So within, for example, a transit-oriented development neighborhood, on average, prices increase, but maybe older apartments don't increase as much, so they can remain affordable. Or if these relationships are statistically significant, then we could say if we increase transit-oriented development, then the rich go to transit-oriented development, and if income is associated with rent, then if the rich go to transit-oriented development, then rent is lower for the non-rich, which is, the relationships here aren't very strong, but it's kind of maybe what we're seeing, that rent in transit-oriented development is higher, but in other neighborhood types, it's lower. So I don't know if that's because the rich went to transit-oriented development, and the other neighborhoods were left to the other non-rich populations. That's kind of the filtering approach, that when we build new housing, the rich move into that new housing, and they free up their older units, and then everyone moves up the ladder into what's available for their income level. There isn't a lot of, I didn't test filtering, and it's hard to do, and there isn't a lot of evidence that happens, especially not very fast. Over 30 years, 40 years, we might see some filtering, but it doesn't happen fast enough for that to have a meaningful effect, usually.
If there are no other questions, Anya, I didn't see. To what extent did you take job accessibility into account for each separately? You did, right?
So job accessibility is at the neighborhood level.
Yeah.
So these models do control for job accessibility.
Can you say something about it's car-based job accessibility? Not
it's transit-based. It's public transport-based. It's 45. It's from the Environmental Protection Agency data. 45 minutes of public transport use.
We didn't take car accessibility into account.
No, I didn't. I did control for proximity to highways, which I don't like it, but some papers look at it as kind of a car accessibility measure, and also proximity to the central business district does control for also car accessibility.
Some other observation is, I think that for me, that providing more transit-oriented development leads to an increase in prices in transit-oriented development makes completely sense to me. The more there is, the more attractive it is to live in these environments, right? Because you can go to more other places that have both jobs and your friends or your family. So there will be a certain peak, right? At a certain point, you will have achieved enough. So those people that like this kind of neighborhoods will have enough supply and it will start dropping, which you mightn't see in New York, maybe. Any reflections on that effect occurring or not?
So I think that theoretically you are right. I think that what we are seeing, at least in this data, is that we're still in the, as we build it, people see it as more attractive stage. I'm not sure that how and if only in transit-oriented development we could reach the stage where kind of supply is enough to meet demand, because if transit-oriented development are only around rail stations, then it depends on the number of rail stations there are. And in some metropolitan areas, that could be 10, right? In New York, it's in the hundreds. But in Austin, Texas, there are, I think, 6 rail stations or 10 rail stations. So the number of transit-oriented developments are limited by the number of rail stations. Not to speak of opposition for denser development in some areas and land use regulation. So I think that it would be difficult to meet all the demand just by transit-oriented development. You have to build a wider set of neighborhoods. And actually, some neighborhoods, for example, the equivalent but farther away from rail stations, the pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods also have very high levels of accessibility, but it's bus-based accessibility. And that's where most of the low-income households live, kind of in those bus-based neighborhoods, older housing units, closer to the central business district.
More questions, Danny? I just don't want to monopolize.
David has a question.
Yeah, really interesting talk. Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering about the year in which they were built, because you talked about how that could cause depreciation. And if the transit-oriented developments were mostly built, let's say, within the last 10 years, maybe you're seeing, maybe what you're seeing is actually an artifact of the year in which it was built.
The year
development,
or
that the newer development, if all the TODs are newer, then they would be higher valued, higher rent, and it would be a result. The rent would be a result of the year in which it was built, more than the location that it was built.
So that's why I control for the share of new housing units in a neighborhood. So even after controlling for new housing units in a neighborhood, transit accessibility and TOD neighbor built environment are still more expensive. So even if so for neighborhoods with a similar share of new housing units, TODs are still more expensive. For example, a rail-oriented intermediate development. So I agree that So that's kind of the share of new development, the second variable up here, is positive and does have a positive effect on median gross rent. But even after controlling for that, this is the same model, then transit accessibility and transit-oriented development are still more expensive, or still have a positive effect. But for sure, new development is one part that makes transit-oriented development more expensive, because transit-oriented development are one of two neighborhoods with the largest share of new development in the 6 neighborhood types that I looked at. So it's an important factor.
Can you go back to the graph you had a minute ago? I want to make
Which
sure.
one?
The curves. This one. The percentage of housing units. So in the x-axis is the percentage of housing units in transit-oriented development. So the more you build, the more the prices decrease in all other environments. Is that not great? First of all, we're lacking this environment. This is an environment that will be sustainable and resilient in the future, and it decreases prices everywhere else. What more can you wish? Build only transit-oriented development, nothing else, I would say. And yes, those environments will be expensive, but it's not that the other houses will disappear because of this. This is wonderful. I don't agree with your conclusion.
Okay.
That you should build in the other environment. I think it's a mistake. And also, if you add to this, and that's another question I want to ask, in transit-oriented development, your car ownership level can be lower, either have less cars or use it less. So your transport costs are lower. So housing plus transport costs are maybe comparable to other neighborhoods. So then the whole argument against transit-oriented development being expensive also disappears. So stop sending the wrong message to the world. Build transit-oriented development, also in Israel.
So I'm not saying don't build transit-oriented development. I'm saying
build only transit-oriented development.
Okay. I agree and disagree. First of all, I didn't have time and it wasn't the topic here, but of course I also looked in my dissertation on transportation costs and affordability. And there we see that it's true that transportation costs in transit-oriented development are lower, but they're not sufficiently lower to make these neighborhoods affordable in standard 30 or 45% of income measures. So we still need to help, if we want lower income households to be able to live in transit-oriented development, we still need to give them some assistance to live there. Especially if higher income households want to live there, then they would bid up the rent even more and make these neighborhoods even less affordable. It's true that if we only build transit-oriented development, at least based on this graph, then other neighborhoods would be more affordable, but it would come at the expense of some of these other neighborhoods, for example, rail-oriented intermediate development, because they're also around rail, so you just turn those neighborhoods into transit-oriented development. It's one option. But then also, again, what you're saying is around rail stations, build transit-oriented development. But we also have to think about the neighborhoods that are not near rail stations and what they look like. And in Israel, they're pretty dense. But in the United States, like we saw, they're single family, flat, lower density neighborhoods. And what I'm saying is that even those, we need to increase densities, even those in those neighborhoods, and that would moderate housing costs even more.
One thing I didn't catch, is this an aggregate across the United States? Or
So this graph It's at the neighborhood level, or it's at the metropolitan level. So a metropolitan level, so with an X share of housing units in transit-oriented development, housing costs in a neighborhood would decrease or increase by Y amount. So it's an interaction between a metropolitan level variable, which is share of housing units in transit-oriented development, and neighborhood type, which is a neighborhood level factor.
But I guess David wants to know if there are different metros with different trends. Is the trend uniform in all metros?
I actually didn't look at trends in different metros to see how they vary. It could be that in some it's negative, maybe in some it's positive.
עוד שאלות, הערות?
אפשר שאלה, דני?
בהחלט.
היי, שלום. יש לי שתי שאלות. אחת, אני מצטער על העברית שלי. אחת, האם אתה חושב הרי ארצות הברית זו מדינה שהיא מאוד מוטת רכב פרטי. האם אתה חושב שבמדינות אחרות, למשל באירופה או במזרח, היית מקבל תוצאות אחרות למחקר הזה? והשאלה השנייה, יש בשימוש ברכב פרטי, בעיניי לפחות, אני יודע שקארל לא ממש אוהב את הטענה הזאת, אבל יש הרבה מאוד עניין חברתי, זאת אומרת של תפיסות, ואנשים שרואים את עצמם בתור אנשים שמשתמשים ברכב, במקרים רבים רואים את עצמם כאנשים אולי יותר חופשיים, או משהו מאוד אינדיבידואליסטי שגם מתחבר מאוד לחברה האמריקאית, בעיניי לפחות. אז גם בהקשר הזה, אני חושב שבמקומות אחרים היית מקבל תוצאות אחרות.
So I'll answer in English for the non-Hebrew speakers. So the first question was, how would these results apply to Europe or Asia or even Israel in terms of housing? And the second question was, with the social context of auto ownership in the US, how would these results apply if in less auto-oriented countries, I guess? So that's both are, I think I'm mainly trying to think about the first question. For example, how would these results apply to Israel? And I think we will see different results because the urban context in the United States is so much different. For example, from Europe and from even Israel. In Europe and Israel, metropolitan areas are much denser and I think more walkable. If I think of Israel, most neighborhoods have there's a business area with a few shops and a grocery store and maybe a coffee shop and stuff like that. And there's more transit, there's more bus service. And neighborhoods in general are denser. So I think that in Israel, it makes more sense kind of, we already have the variety of neighborhood types that I'm talking about. And now it's just increasing density around rail stations where it's already somewhat dense. For example, if we look at along the metro, the future metro in Tel Aviv, the subway in Tel Aviv, the metropolitan area there is already dense, and it's just about increasing densities there. But because, and also I'll say that the way I see it, Tel Aviv City is basically a transit-oriented development in terms of combining transit with kind of social amenities like bars and coffee shops. And then once you go out of Tel Aviv City to Ramat Gan, to Petah Tikva, to Rishon LeZion, then you kind of lose that the fun that attracts people, right? It's expensive there because of other factors, because of housing supply and demand in general, and I don't think it's because of proximity to rail or proximity to local amenities like it is in the United States. I think maybe once the United States reaches a density level like Israel, then these factors won't be as relevant. As for auto ownership, there are studies that show that the people that move into transit-oriented development in the United States still use the car for commute trips, to go to work. So a lot of people move to transit-oriented development in the United States, not for just for its transit accessibility, but more for its built environment aspects. And so that's why, so if we separate the two, the accessibility from the built environment aspects, then we kind of get both of them. So I think that, and in Israel, at least, again, densities are high, even where I guess transit accessibility is pretty good in Tel Aviv overall metropolitan area or Haifa metropolitan area, that I think the relationships are similar. I think the United States is similar. It's unique. I mean, it's not, I think that in Europe and Israel and Asia for sure, the results will be different. And maybe the neighborhood built environment factors won't be as significant as they are in the United States. But I'm happy to hear other people's opinions, because I'm not sure.
3:30 כמעט עכשיו, אז אני מציע שנסיים את הדיון. כמובן מי שרוצה להמשיך מוזמן לתפוס את מתן, שמתן אני לא יודע מתי ממשיך לשבת בחדר בפקולטה או לא, אבל לפחות זמן מסוים היית מאוד זמין שם.
נכון, אבל לא יודע, אפשר, אני לא יודע מה מדיניות הטכניון היום, אני אשמח ללכת, אבל...
אוקיי, בכל מקרה אפשר להמשיך.
אבל אפשר לשלוח לי אימייל ואני אשמח לצאת מהבית.
מצוין.
מדיניות הטכניון לחוקרים יכולים להגיע לטכניון כמה שרוצים.
אוקיי, מעולה.
טוב, אז תודה רבה מתן, חג שמח לכולנו, וניפגש בעוד שבועיים, אתם כבר תקבלו אימיילים ממני בעניין הזה. תודה ולהתראות.
תודה רבה.
תודה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.